The Blockchain Show is a podcast that demystifies cryptocurrencies and distributed ledger technology.
Hello, and welcome back to The Blockchain Show. My guest today is Will Martino from Kadena. How are you doing today, Will?
Good. Thanks for having me.
So I know that we have a lot of interesting things to get into in terms of smart contracts, because I know you came with a background in JPMorgan, is that correct?
Yeah, it's actually where I met my co-founder, Stuart Popejoy. We were on this R&D group that started in JPMorgan's Brooklyn office that pretty quickly evolved into being its blockchain center of excellence.
So that seems like the heartbeat center of not just blockchain, but financial centers in the world. So I was hoping we could maybe talk about your background and how you met your co-founder, kind of just go from there into the company.
Sure. Sounds good. I met Stu at JPMorgan. Before that, I was actually at the Securities and Exchange Commission. I was the lead engineer for a quant group that was building the forensic data analysis tools that are now deployed nationwide. And when I was there, Valerie started the cryptocurrency working group, and they needed someone who understood the tech and had the clearance and didn't own any coin at the time. This was back before Mt. Gox. And I raised my hand to kind of be in the room and help people to think about this new technology. After being in the government for a few years, I left and went to JPMorgan, where I met Stu, my co-founder. Before I met Stu, he was also at JPMorgan for years rebuilding their agency algo trading platform. It's a pretty important piece of background in that when he was doing this, rebuilding this quant trading system, he made a software programming language that the sales traders at JPMorgan actually still directly use today. So these are non-engineers who are nonetheless technical and intelligent, who are programming in such a way, or in this language that he made, that goes into production 48 hours later. Lessons he learned in that experience have impacted the real core of our offering on our platform, which is this new smart contract language called Pact. So when Stu and I met at JPMorgan, he was running the Haskell desk. I was his second hire. Pretty quickly, we started working on blockchain projects. And eventually, after about a year of meeting everyone from Vitalik to Digital Asset to basically all of the blockchain vendors in the space, because they all want to talk to JPMorgan and get JPMorgan to use their product. We, during that time, collected a bunch of questions, technical questions we knew needed to be answered if this technology was really going to go into production at a large enterprise, be able to do real business on it. And during that period, we're also building this program called Juno. It was JPMorgan's first blockchain. It was a private blockchain. Effectively, it was JPMorgan Coin version 0, doing international payments. We open sourced it, released it to Hyperledger, and then left and founded Kadena.
So I take it is your relationship with JPMorgan over now?
It's a pretty small community, and we're based in Brooklyn, and they're still based in Brooklyn. So we keep in touch with the people there. After Juno kind of moonlighted because Stu and I left, Quorum was the next project that was really brought into the limelight.
Technically, with the software that your co-founder wrote, would that be proprietary, belonging to JPMorgan?
No. So when we were doing Juno and presenting it to Hyperledger, JPMorgan had to actually open source the entire code base under a BSD3 license to be able to present it to Hyperledger for adoption. So the code that is out there is completely free for anyone to use. I think it now lives on our GitHub. It's important to note that the smart contract language Pact is informed by his experience, but he didn't work on it at all at JPMorgan. We didn't think that JPMorgan was the right place to build the kind of technology that we knew the entire industry across the board, or really the whole world would need to really take blockchain technology to its true potential. Because were we to try to build it there and to try to push it, and JPMorgan's brand is quite valuable, and they're not an emerging tech company, so it's very difficult to push this bleeding edge emerging technology from inside of a large bank that's very well respected across the world.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Do you remember back when the internet was kind of new and there was the internet and the intranet, and there was kind of like more companies had their own version of the internet? I kind of wondered what the future of blockchain is going to mean, because we're kind of in it feels like an in-between transitionary. Bitcoin is not quite the buzzword that it used to be. You have such a unique insight into these spaces. I guess my question is, do you think that in order for something like, what you're trying to do at Kadena, is it possible to do it closed source, or is it necessary to have it open source, kind of open it up to the world? A mass adoption is really my, kind of my point here.
Mm-hmm. It's a solid question. I don't think that anything that is going to be used by general, normal people, we're not talking about, large institutions, can ever be successful and be closed source. An example of this, I think, is Hashgraph's consensus protocol. Their actual node software is patented and closed source, and I think it's going to stand in the way of adoption in a pretty dramatic way. So at Kadena, the smart contract language we built, Pact, which also has some full formal verification of user code. It's fully open source. It's been open source for over 2.5 years. The formal verification system is all open source. That's been out for coming on about a year now. And the public blockchain that we're building and going into testnet at the end of March 2019, that is going to also be fully open source. We have a private blockchain that also runs Pact, our language, and that right now is proprietary, but that's aimed at an audience where proprietary is seen much more as a virtue. And these are larger enterprises that really do want to have these high service level agreements and really want to have one vendor to go to be able to integrate things. And as well, we also have the free community edition of our private blockchain that's available now on AWS. This version comes with, it doesn't come with the enterprise plugins, so the Oracle or DB2 adapters, certain messaging layer plugins, but everything else is available out of the box. And that one, you can go and turn it on and play around with it right now and see what a real high performance private blockchain with a next generation smart contract language looks like.
Fascinating. Well, thanks for the background and kind of bringing me up to speed. Would you mind talking a little bit about Kadena? And
so your comment on the intranet versus the internet back in the day is very present for this conversation. We don't see public versus private blockchain at Kadena. We see just blockchain, much in the same way that we don't really talk about the internet and the intranet anymore. There's the internet, and then there's the version of the internet that you run inside of your company. But there's not a totally different technology stack for what you run in a large organization. It's a very similar protocol. It just runs in a different domain. So at Kadena, we started out focused on enterprise blockchain because that was our backgrounds. We had all this experience at JPMorgan. We definitely had a head start on market research over the rest of our competition, and we were able to quickly build a high-performance private blockchain called Scalable BFT. This is the system that's out for free on AWS right now. And Pact, our smart contract language. Pact is really the killer app of our platform in that it is a language that is designed to be specific to the domain of blockchain transactions. So it is a simple, easy to use language. It's designed for lawyers and executives to be able to read, if not write, because in 5 years, when blockchain technology is taking off and going through the roof, you're going to need to have lawyers and executives be able to review smart contracts. Either for compliance or to make sure that the business flow is is being adhered to. Also, Pact is designed for integrating into the gnarliest large enterprise back office database systems. This comes a lot out of Stuart and I's experience in looking either, in my part, auditing bank back offices and his part actually working on them. We know that any system that takes off and gets adoption is going to run into the problem of how do you integrate it with the world as it exists today. Part of that is integrating it with the lawyers who you're never going to train to be engineers, and that is addressed by making an easy to understand language. And part of it is by having a language that's designed for interop, that is designed for having interactions with existing back offices. So we did that for about a year, got a couple Fortune 100 clients that we've been working with since. And I think it was about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, started working on, what would it look like if we built a public blockchain that ran Pact, this smart contract language. Because, well, Stuart and I don't think that there's ever going to be one chain to rule them all on the public blockchain side. We do very much believe there's going to be one smart contract language to rule them all. In much the same way that the internet standardized, relatively speaking, quickly on one language, one protocol, kind of one approach, and it's why we don't talk about internet and intranet anymore. They used a very similar approach across the stack. So we started working on that and came up with this really innovated and discovered a way of scaling proof of work. This is called Chainweb, and it goes into testnet at the end of March 2019. And it is a braided parallel chain proof of work protocol. We don't use proof of stake. We use the only consensus mechanism that's actually been proven in the field to be safe and to work reliably. And we just increase its throughput dramatically without having to have it cost any more energy. So instead of the very basic idea of it is that with a Bitcoin or an Ethereum, and anonymous, anyone can come in and mine the next block in the chain. And when you mine that block, it points at the previous block in the chain. With Chainweb, think of a two-chain version of Chainweb. So when you mine the next block in either chain 1 or chain 2, it points at the previous block in chain 1 and also the previous block in chain 2. And as you do this, you end up doubling the throughput. You don't need any more energy because you're actually chopping the difficulty per block in half in this case. And you're actually increasing the security. This idea of having two chains braided together is an older idea than Kadena. It's called Betacoin or block rope. And you can find it on the Bitcoin forums. And it was proposed first for security, not for throughput. Kadena's main contribution is figuring out how to take that seed of an idea and actually scale it dramatically. So we added graph theory to be able to go instead of having 2 or 10 chains in parallel to having hundreds, if not thousands of chains long term. The beauty of the stack that we've built is that outside of the different consensus protocols that we built, Scalable, BFT, or Chainweb, the rest of the stack, top to bottom, is the same. So it'll work just as well for an entrepreneur as well for a large enterprise. The benefits of our stack, of what we offer, are twofold. The stack itself is, for the most part, uniform. Whether you're a large enterprise or an entrepreneur, you're going to have a common stack to work with, except for those two differences in the consensus protocol. If you run a private chain, then you use the private chain system we built. If you want to run on public, you can use the public. But you can also build hybrid applications. So you can build something that does the kind of proof of authority network on a contract on the public chain, but does the kind of the larger computation in smart contracts on a private chain that is looking at that public chain's proof of authority contract. And yeah, we're really excited. It's one of the, there's a few visions of how this space can evolve. One of them is the hub and spoke model, as seen in Cosmos. We're big fans of those guys, very friendly with them, and wish them the best. Another kind of vision for how this could work is having a very fat central throughput pipe. This would be Chainweb, and then hybrid applications that are kind of sticking off the side of the central network.
This is a very complex project you guys are undertaking. But real quickly, I wanted to go back to some of the transactions, because most people think of money still when they think of, blockchain. Bitcoin is probably in most people's minds. Think most people like in Nebraska who don't know. Well, I don't know. There's a few people that listen to the show in Nebraska. I shouldn't say that. But I guess my question is, what are some of the transactions that you guys are seeing now or facilitating now, and what are some transactions maybe not possible yet that you maybe anticipate in the future?
That's a deep and interesting question. I think the first thing that I'd point your listeners at is a blog post I did on Medium about kind of this vision of a sharing economy, except instead of sharing physical assets, you're actually going to be sharing business processes. And this comes out of how Pact, our smart contract language, works. So Kadena, really it's Pact, because for me and for Kadena, it's all about smart contracts, making them safe, reliable, fast, easy to understand. These should be things that you want to write all the time because it's so easy and safe to use. It shouldn't be something that you hold your nose and you hope to God there isn't a bug in. So we can service all of the traditional kind of use cases of just simple token transfers back and forth. One of the things that you can do with the language that we built that you can't do with any other is have a safe interaction, have safe on-chain interop between smart contracts themselves. A lot of people forget that when Ethereum was first being marketed way back in the day, it was supposed to do two things. One was to do something which is now called the ERC20 or tokenization. They totally nailed that one and made a $20 billion, $40 billion market cap network out of it. The second is that the smart contracts on Ethereum were actually supposed to be smart services that would interact with each other inside of a single transaction. So you can think of an example of this, of people who have attempted it on Ethereum, is parity multisig. So there was the multisig contract, and then a bunch of people came and interacted with that contract to make their own wallet without having to clone all of the logic that the contract represents. But here's the problem with the approach that Ethereum took. They didn't do it in a way that's safe. So now you have parity multisig being broken on chain because someone poked it in the wrong spot, having a huge amount of money locked up on the Ethereum network, and people don't know what to do. It's there should be some way of fixing smart contracts that are out in the wild without needing to resort to tweeting Vitalik or playing political games to try to convince the community, oh, we should do a fork to release these funds or not. Because we have the ability to do this interaction, it means that you can actually expose not only just a token that represents something using our smart contract language, but you can actually expose a chunk of a business workflow. So for example, KYC, a know your customer workflow, that some other contract needs to use. It doesn't have to build it and do it itself. It can just go and import an existing contract that's on chain. It's going to have to pay that service, that contract, some fee to access its data, because that the person who was running that system should be compensated. But the downstream contract doesn't actually need to replicate all this behavior themselves. They can just use the existing behavior on chain and then continue to focus on what their contract is really meant to be doing, kind of the core business aspects of this idea that they're putting onto a public or private chain.
Yeah. And I really like the idea of one smart contract to rule them all. When I think smart contracts, I still think Ethereum. So could you maybe just expand a little bit on how Kadena is doing it better, I guess, for lack of a better word?
It's a long list of features. It depends on kind of who the audience is. If you're a Ethereum engineer, someone who's worked with Solidity and you're listening, the sales pitch to you starts with, it has error messages, and then goes on to say that Pact, our smart contract language, you can upgrade contracts on chain without needing to resort to, tweeting Vitalik if they're broken. In Pact, when you make a smart contract, the first thing you do is you give it a name, and the second thing you do is you give it a function that describes how it's governed, how it's upgraded. And that function can be whatever you want. It can be just a set of 2 signatures out of 3 that allow you to get admin rights and perform an upgrade, or it can be a decentralized vote, or it can be a hybrid, or it can be something totally ridiculous like, I don't know, every Tuesday that is an odd day, then you can do an upgrade. If you're someone who's looking at it from the point of view of a large enterprise, kind of the idea behind why you should take it very seriously is, one, it can interact with the existing systems that you have. We have backend plugins for MySQL, Postgres, I think Oracle at this point. I don't think we've done the DB2. Also, your devs are going to have a very easy time using it because it's actually designed for business people and lawyers to be able to understand, if not also write. Moreover, and this goes for everyone, it has formal verification. And this isn't in this space right now, in crypto, people are talking about formal verification as this far, long off, kind of incredible reach goal for 2 or 3 years from now. Pact has had formal verification of user code. So this is literally, you write a contract and then you can write how it should be verified. Mathematical models that the computer can go and prove for you. It's had this for coming up on a year now. And you can actually go to pact.kadena.io and play with it yourself right now in your browser. This is just a dramatic sea change for smart contracts. it has this huge impact on pushing the space forward from a safety point of view. And one of the reasons that we have the ability to do this is that Pact is a Turing incomplete language. And this is by design. Pact is meant to be specific to the domain of transactions on a blockchain. And as such, you don't need to be able to do things like fold proteins or to find the shortest path from where I'm sitting in Brooklyn to right above LA where Ian is. There's no reason to do that on a blockchain. So because of that, we limited the language to make it safer, much more lucid, so bugs didn't have a lot of places to hide. And then after that, we then figured out that we could do formal verification for it.
It's crazy thinking about all the people around the world who just get on their computer for nefarious purposes and how much time and energy we have to spend to guard against it. But I really appreciate you taking the time to explain that. Earlier, you mentioned some Fortune 500s, and I definitely saw, would it have been a deal made with Amazon?
So we went and put our private chain, which had only been proprietary until I think it was January when it went out, maybe mid-February. We developed a community edition of that and put it into Amazon's marketplace. This is for the general public. Anyone right now can go online and start one of the fastest private blockchains that's around, with the only smart contract language that has formal verification, is actually a pleasure and easy to use.
I like that. And going with that is someone who kind of new to smart contracts, would they be able to benefit from your platform?
Yeah. So because Kadena is so focused on a practical application of this technology, we knew we needed to have lawyers and executives be able to understand Pact, or smart contract language code. And by virtue of that, it makes it unbelievably easy for developers to learn it. Now, that's because non-developers are meant to be able to understand it. So there's an analogy I like to use, which is that it's not uncommon to see marketers or salespeople learning this programming language called SQL. It's what you use to query databases, because by learning SQL, they have the ability to then go and search through the database on their own instead of having to ask a developer for their help. I know this has happened because I personally taught a few of them. They've used it to great avail to rise through the ranks quickly because they're able to do the job of multiple people in a much shorter time frame because they've learned how to express this question that they want to ask. And the reason that these people who are technical and domain experts but aren't programmers can learn something like SQL is that the language is pared down and focused enough on what the domain that is going to be used in is. And for SQL, it is databases and queries. For Pact, it is transactions. Because the language is so focused on being really good at the only place that it's going to be used, it makes it very easy for people who aren't even programmers to pick it up.
Got you. Any other hurdles that you see that we haven't really talked about yet that's going to kind of help us all get towards this mass adoption?
I think one of the biggest hurdles is the UX around public and private keys. Public and private keys and the management of them is just difficult. There's no kind of two ways around it. It's one of the nice parts of blockchain and of crypto in that because the domain is so open once you actually launch a platform, you need to upfront all of these usually later stage problems and think about them in a holistic way from day one. And I think that that Samsung bringing out we're putting a crypto wallet into their Android phones, and from what I hear, having some defaulted dApps that are going to be installed on it is going to be one of the things that's going to help to push the space forward. Because using a hardware wallet is quite difficult for most people, and using a phone if you can use a phone with a secure enclave, that's really pretty good security. So I think that'll help the space a lot. So it's really just solving that UX problem. So I'd say probably the other thing that the space needs to get to or to get past for broader adoption is, to a certain extent, it's just some time to get over the hangover of the last hype cycle and to allow the noise to die down a bit because right now it's very hard to distinguish fact from fiction. things that make sense. And once we're beyond that point and the tide has gone out and we know who's still standing, then we're going to have a much easier time of actually being able to say this stuff is real and pushing these use cases forward.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes I wonder how much the general public cares about decentralization, how decentralized, is necessary or how decentralized is possible. Is there anything that you want to cover or expand on that maybe I haven't asked you yet?
Sure. I think there's probably a couple things. One is that formal verification is still a thing that most of the market is getting educated on. And it's why we haven't really pushed the marketing and education from just our side yet, because the global market needed to really learn more about what it could do and kind of get used to this idea. But now that it's here, I think that one thing to point out is to help people to have maybe kind of a framework to think about it within, or kind of a metaphor to understand, okay, what is formal verification for? So smart contracts, so with traditional contracts, you have effectively the quote unquote fine print, where you need to read through it and make sure there aren't any gotchas in this contract you're going to sign. With smart contracts, that problem is much harder because the gotchas, that fine print, those things that make the contract, the smart contract, do things that you don't want it to do, are actually usually missing from the contract itself, from the thing you're looking at. So what formal verification is doing in a metaphorical sense is it's the lens, it's the magnifying glass that you use to look for the fine print in a smart contract, except that you can't see the fine print. You need to check a effectively infinite space of possibilities to deduce, is there any fine print that could be here that I haven't looked at or looked for yet? So that's one. Your question on decentralization, and if the market really cares about it, I would say that decentralization is a tool. And there are some domains where it makes a lot of sense to use it, and there are some where it doesn't. You can almost think of a public chain as being a real public blockchain, as being fully decentralized, and a private chain as being fully effectively centralized if you really want it to be locked down. And so the question for decentralization is, what application are you building and where on that spectrum between fully centralized and fully decentralized should it go? There's a lot of use cases like CryptoKitties, for example, that are a hybrid of public and private, that are a hybrid of being centralized and decentralized. And our platform is designed for being able to service anywhere on this spectrum of decentralization, because we realize that real work, real business that's going to get done on these platforms, those businesses are going to evolve over time. And they may end up splitting into different parts or having different verticals. And some of those verticals and some of those parts are going to need to run on a more centralized or more decentralized approach. And if you don't have the ability to service that approach from day one, if you haven't really thought about, okay, what does long-term adoption 5 years out look like, then you're going to run into the problems that we've seen with things like Ethereum, where there was a huge amount of money dumped into it, a huge amount of hype, and the use cases, the actual dApps, they almost didn't materialize. The promise is still there. It's just that when you try to take these things prime time, you need to be focused on what that looks like and be able to, and know you're going to be able to service it, because otherwise people will try and fail and it won't be their own fault. It'll just be the system wasn't ready for it.
Right. Yeah. And definitely seen a lot of, even startups that have been on this podcast come and go. And it really kind of makes you think, where the trend is going. And I think, money, business is very important. That's really what's going to help scale this sort of technology to the point where it's going to be beneficial to, the everyday person. Please tell us where we can go to learn more and possibly get involved.
Sure. Thanks for having me. You can go to Kadena.io for more information about Kadena and follow us on Twitter at Kadena_IO. We'll be launching our testnet at the end of March 2019 and having a meetup at Distributed Global in New York City. Please join us. We will be happy to see you and to teach all about this, or you can just hang out with other people that are interested. And yeah, looking forward to the next year where we get to focus on projects that are shipping versus products that are marketing, we'll just say.
Awesome. Well, Will, thank you so much for your time. I definitely look forward with great anticipation to what you guys work on, and hopefully we can chat again in maybe 6 months to 8 months down the road.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Right on. Have a good one.
To learn more, visit theblockchainshow.com.